Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. With U.S. President Donald Trump signing new sanctions against Russia into law, bringing about what the American Secretary of State Rex Tillerson termed as the worst relations between Washington and Moscow since the Cold War, we will evaluate the implications during today's program on the coordinated efforts of both countries in the various arenas of the Middle East. To further discuss this topic, I'm joined here in the studio by Professor Zeev Hanin, who is an expert on Russia and Middle Eastern studies at Ilan and Ariel universities. Welcome.
Pleasure to be with you.
I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Dr. Mordechai Kedar, who is a Middle East expert at Ilan University.
My pleasure and honor.
Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding of the current relations or dynamic between Moscow and Washington.
Cooperation alongside confrontation characterized this relationship even during the Cold War, which ended in late 1991 with the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And now we have another sort of this dichotomy, cooperation alongside coordination, alongside confrontation. And the Middle East is probably the most violent region in which it can be seen. Of course, there is also the Ukraine and other parts in Europe. But in the Middle East, there are various interests which converge at times, but diverge at other times. In Syria, especially, you can find some room for cooperation, especially in the southeastern part of the country. But in other areas, the Russians want to stay for their own quote-unquote imperial interests, while the Americans want to get rid of ISIS, of Daesh, and go home.
Professor Hanin, when we're talking about the current situation, both the United States and Russia do identify a joint interest. And this joint interest, which Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has emphasized, is the security concerns of the Middle East. His counterpart in Russia, Lavrov, re-emphasized that more into the semantics of terrorism, what Russia, of course, defines as terrorism.
Right.
How much of a joint interest at this time with strained relation is something that both countries can align in really bringing about the various changes or solutions to the various conflicts?
Well, the funny thing is that now, while they're talking about the new wave of the so-called Cold War, and some people believe that now the dispute between Russia and the United States is even stronger than it was at the end of the Soviet power, in the Soviet period. Still, the level of agreement, the attempts to find the mutual way together to each other is also relatively high. People are now talking a lot about the sanctions, counter-sanctions, and the dispute between two people, two ambitious leaders. One is Vladimir Putin and another is Donald Trump. And of course, the high level of disappointment, which is the result of the high level of mutual expectations, even more than some people probably expected a couple of years ago. Then, of course, they brought the strengths of the dispute between two people. Still, the list of points of the cooperation is still the same as it was like half a year ago. They were talking, Russians, American leaders were talking about the way to solve the Crimea issue. And probably here we don't see much dispute. As Donald Trump said at the beginning, we're not going to exchange Ukraine with Syria, and that's what is going on. And in Kremlin, they accepted that. Second, and of course, the whole Syrian issue, and here I agree with Amir that at the moment, two leaders are more or less agreed upon how the settlement should be decided afterwards. And finally, the whole issue of interference of Russia into American elections, or the whole story is very much exaggerated to my mind.
Dr. Kedar, how do you perceive this?
Well, if I compare the two ways how both countries, Russia and the United States, are looking at the Middle East, you can see vast differences. From the Russian point of view, we see the strategy. They know what they want. They have a goal, a strategic goal, which will take a long time, and they will keep it for even longer time. And they derive everything from this strategy, whatever they do or refrain from doing. While the Americans are actually clueless except for getting rid of ISIS. This is the only thing which the Americans really know that they have some kind of a goal, which is something between tactic and operational issue. It's not a strategy. And not only this, Putin is the guy who decides on everything, and he's there for years already, and he will stay there for who knows how many years to come. While the American policy is determined by rookies. First of all, one is named Trump. What does he know about international issues? What did they know about Middle East? What does he know about Syria? He knows nothing. And his crew are even dumber than him in this issue. And every week they change another key person in his crew. So, first of all, there is no strategy. Secondly, they have tactics. They know they have to fight this fight against ISIS here. They have to do this here. But there is no strategy.
Nevertheless, he did appoint several very key figures who have had quite some experience in the region, including the Secretary of Defense and some other key people who do understand the complexities of this region. And at the same time, it might not be translated into a strategy, but the tactical aspects of things are operating.
This is why I kept them, because don't forget that most of them served the Obama administration. Means somebody who is totally different mindset than Trump, they served him, so he uses them only because of the experience which they accumulated on the ground. But from the strategic point of view, what does he want from them? What does he want from them to achieve? I'm not sure he knows.
Dr. Kedar probably referred to the movie, the comedy Dumb and Dumber, which was screened a few years ago. I beg to differ. They are not dumber than their president. But we can argue this issue later.
Thank you.
But there are 2 points here, just to follow up on what you said. One is that the Russian interference in American politics makes it a domestic issue. This is not only a foreign policy issue as it is in Russia. In Russia, not only does Putin decide, but this is not a domestic issue. He issues orders and others follow. In the States, it's a domestic issue, and President Trump keeps saying, let's move on to other issues, but he can't get rid of it. The other thing is, under the American system, Congress has a role, and Congress forced the sanctions on Trump, and what we saw, of course, in retaliation, was the expulsion of hundreds of American diplomats or spies in the guise of diplomats. So Putin is not a master of his own house. And in his house, you mentioned Secretary Mattis. Yes, it is true that the Pentagon is probably the most coherent or the only coherent shop in town right now. But it is anti-Russian. It is more anti-Russian than the White House or the National Security Council is. And they see Russia as what they call a near peer. They see Russia at the top of the list of their threats. And, you know, a few decades ago, in the 80s, there was the Reverend Jesse Jackson, and he liked to mix metaphors. So he said that the window of opportunity is open, but the bear, the Russian bear, put its paw into it. So is there a window of opportunity here? Is the Russian bear trying to come in? If Obama, at the time, tried a reset and failed, Trump doesn't call it a reset, but he is trying to reset the relationship, and he doesn't have the power to.
Professor Hanin?
I would say, continuing this point, that I wouldn't overestimate the Russian interference into American affairs. Even if there was an interference, I don't think that the result was so dramatic as people prefer to say. On the other hand, I wouldn't overestimate the content of this confrontation, this dispute, concerning the fact that there are a list of indicative steps, but none of them damages the level of relations the two countries have. Of course, they might expel a couple of, a few tens, a few dozens of diplomats from the United States to Russia and from Russia to the United States. But nobody is going to stop the provision of mineral resources from Russia to Europe. Nobody is going to stop cooperation in space. Nobody is going to stop the titanium issues. Nobody is going to stop the cooperation in the Middle Eastern issues. And here, I would also approach to what Professor Kedar said by claiming that Russia does have a strategy. It is true, but I would say that the strategy is based on the tactics much more than strategy itself. If we will take into account the entrance of invasion of Russian military into Syria, then pulling out or declared pulling out of Russian military from there, readiness to join the Geneva process or to exchange the Geneva process with so-called Astana process, inviting Americans to Astana and now saying that actually we are going to, or we are ready to manage it by ourselves. I would say that this flexibility might relate to strategy, but it's much more tactical to my mind.
Dr. Kedar?
Well, there is another difference which we should note. Russia, on the Russian side, you see a leader or a leading country, which is Russia, and two countries which actually follow, which is Iran and Turkey behind it. So what we do see here, an orchestra with a conductor and an orchestra, means the Iranians. While in America, on the American side, we see totally different picture. The Americans, first of all, try not to lead anything. They are trying to rely on local powers, whether it's the Kurds or the Jordanians or the Saudis or others. And this orchestra, which they try to manage, they don't play the same music. Because Qatar is on one side, and Saudi Arabia is on the other side, and Israel is at all doesn't want, or does want, but they don't want Israel in the orchestra, and Jordan is playing another game, and they actually are more busy arranging this coalition, the anti-ISIS coalition, which they actually succeeded to do, much more than the Russians are busy to tie the Iranians and the Turks to their wagon. So this is another big difference between the two camps. One is consolidated and working, and the other one is looking for targets and doesn't really want what it wants to achieve.
Mr. Oren.
But the reason for that is the difference between a democracy and a dictatorship. And the American democracy, following the lessons of Vietnam and other involvements such as in Lebanon in the early 80s, has decided that it must define vital national security interests before it intervenes, and it must define an exit strategy to know how long it is going to be there and what are going to be the criteria for saying mission accomplished. For the Russians, as you said earlier, it's long-term. For them, there is no exit strategy. They don't want to exit.
Right.
They want to stay there.
Forever.
So they are dominant in that particular issue. But while the Americans want to have the job, go home and let the local proxies fight it out.
Well, one of the questions that arise from this whole story, and this is something that also one of our viewers wanted to ask, is does Russia actually consider the United States in the same manner since U.S. President Donald Trump fired those 57 Tomahawk missiles in order to thwart the Syrian regime's active use of chemical weapons, or allegedly so? Or is it still considering it as a player that seeks to focus on what it wants, take out the Islamic State, and be done with it?
Well, what I can hear from Moscow and what I can see there, speaking with different people, actually the presence of two factions near between the Kremlin and the Smolensk Square, where the Russian Foreign Office situated. I would call them Trump optimists and Trump pessimists. Trump optimists actually believe that nothing changed. And in principle, United States and Russia have very much more in common than the differences. And I agree and disagree with both of you by saying that in principle, on one hand, Russians never believed in outsourcing. If they're interested in their vital security and other interests, they prefer to be on the ground by themselves.
But they disguised it as volunteers in order to keep appearances.
Yes and no, but okay, it is the question of definition, as you know. On the other hand, they understand that the United States at the moment is interested to lead, but with the help of so-called alternative blocs, as Mr. Trump regarded, that forming the Middle Eastern NATO. Professor Kedar knows much better than me whether there is any sense in that, sending their proxies and so on and so forth. But it's much more, as people believe, a superficial difference than the difference in the content. On the other hand, if you will take another faction, so-called Trump pessimists, they actually believe that Russia and the United States might have some points that they might agree, but the points that they have at the moment to disagree is much wider range. So probably the truth is somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Kedar, when we're talking about the United States using the proxy forces, whether it's the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces that are currently battling over the city of Raqqa and have actually accomplished significant gains when we're talking about having already under control some 55% of the entire city, which was for quite some time the de facto capital of the extreme Muslim group in this war-torn country. We do see them fighting with the shadow of the Russian-backed forces just adjacent to that area in the various places where they're also fighting the Islamic State in different fronts and are also showing some kind of danger, but at the same time making sure to stay away to a certain degree from the US-backed forces. How much of a coordinated effort is this from Moscow and Washington, or is this just something that each one understands and they try to keep away from each other?
Well, as much as I understand, Russia actually left Raqqa to the others, to the American and their friends and allies to deal with. We don't hear too much about Russian bombings on Raqqa, and this might be the division because don't forget that Raqqa is more to the east. And apparently the Russians have no aspirations to take the eastern parts of Syria, especially the desert parts. They have aspirations to Latakia and maybe the mountains which overlook Latakia and the coastal area. This more or less, maybe all the way to Aleppo, but not further, or not much further from Aleppo. They leave it for the desert for the Americans and the others. Now here, the Americans know very well that there are at least three parties which are actually behind the scenes fight each other on Raqqa. This is the Turks, these are the Kurds, which they fight each other as well, and the opposition, the Syrian opposition. And everyone wants to grab more of the land and parts of Raqqa in order to make his position better and stronger for the negotiations of how to share the bearskin. And and the Americans, I'm not sure that they really know what they want. Because for them, Turkey, after all, this is a state in NATO. The Kurds, they sympathize with the Kurds. Maybe even if they don't support the Kurdish aspirations for all the way independence, they do have, very warm place in their heart for the Kurds, not to mention the contribution of the Kurds to the effort in Mosul as well, don't forget. And of course, the rebellions the rebels in Syria themselves definitely have some kind of sympathy from the Americans' point of view. So the Americans, I'm not sure that they really know how they want Raqqa to be divided between the three forces, as long as they succeed altogether or separately to topple the ISIS, which they want.
One comment and one suggestion. The comment has to do with Turkey, which you mentioned. Now, Turkey, of course, is one of the most important members of NATO and has been from the start because it has traditionally saw the Soviet Union or earlier Russia
Location.
As an enemy. But now it has shifted. Now, after the coup a year ago, and because President Trump did not deliver Erdogan's arch enemy, Gulen, and other reasons, the Turks have become vehemently anti-Western, not necessarily anti-American, anti-German, anti-European. They have shifted towards the Russians they are going to buy the S-400 surface-to-air missile system, which the Americans don't like. They have a problem with Incirlik Air Base. And so we may see a new realignment there with, as you said, Turkey on the side of the Russians. Now, the suggestion is that 4 weeks from now, on September the 8th, we are going to have a joint birthday. Both Defense Secretary James Mattis and Russian Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov have their birthday on September the 8th. And they are probably the most thoughtful members of their respective administrations. If they can get together for a birthday party and talk it over, maybe we can have something useful.
If
Share
only foreign diplomacy would work that way. But I'd like to ask you, Professor Hanin, when we're talking about Turkey as a shifting force from Western alliances now toward the Moscow and Eastern alliances, do you believe that this factor is actually bringing into question also the strained relations between Washington and Moscow? Will we see some kind of intensifying, rhetoric, if you will, with regard to this situation?
Well, Russia is used to define itself as a Western country, as a European country. But we all know that in principle, the political and social culture of this country is Eurasian rather than Western. So the symbolism plays quite a substantial role. So if you will have a look on the publications in the historical journals, for instance, more and more we see publications about the early days of the Soviet Union, early communist Russia, which actually, as we know, the current regime, Vladimir Putin regime, believes that they are successors of all three: Imperial Russia, Soviet Russia, and Democratic Russia. So when you read one after another articles about cooperations between the early communist Russia and Kemalist Turkey against the Western invasion, British, Greek, and so on and so forth, you start to understand that something happens in this case. Yeah, people more and more believe that probably, and that makes its impact on the decision-making process. So people more and more believe that Turkey and Iran, with the post-communist, pre-communist, and the democratic Russia all together, is actually in the same camp against what is called the West. Yeah. On the other hand, coming back to what Professor Kedar said concerning the interests in Syria and the Middle East in general, and the strategy vis-a-vis tactics, for Russian Federation, there is an interest to preserve by all means, with all resources, using every resource, to preserve Mr. Assad in power. The Washington doesn't have these sentiments concerning Assad. They are probably ready to keep him in power, at least for the time being, but would not cry so heavily if he will go. From this point of view, they have the point of agreement as well as the point of disagreement. And coming back to the tactics, in this case, I believe that Russia is much more interested in tactics rather than strategy. As finally, with the final sentence answering your question, where is Turkey at the moment? In Moscow, they would love to have Turkey on their side 100%, but let us not forget that Turkey is interested to be a balance or to be a bridge between the West and East, between Russia and the Middle East, and to play its own global role as well as the regional role. I wouldn't say that Turkey is in the pocket of anybody.
Dr. Kedar, I'd like to bring Israel into the equation. Israel, of course, has the most significant strategic value with the United States and those relations with the United States, and has maintained those relations, considering it to be its closest ally, especially in the Middle East. But at the same time, it has also very vocal interest with Russia when we're talking about the coordinated mechanism in Syria and other aspects of those bilateral relations between those two countries. How much of a game does Israel currently play when we're talking about Moscow and Washington?
Well, Israel is a small country which lives on the edge of a big fire, tries, and this is what I think what drives Israel, is the attempt not to get burnt with that fire. Means to keep itself as far as could be from the mayhem which is in Syria between Russia and the United States and Turkey and Iran and all those who take part in this. They want, in any case, not to be hurt by this. And for this, you have to coordinate sometimes with the Russians. You have definitely to have to coordinate with the Americans. You have to coordinate with the Jordanians and with some local forces which might be viewed as ultra-Islamists. They also could be kosher in order to cooperate with to some degree. Not to mention the Kurds. And don't forget that the Israeli oil doesn't come from the moon. It comes from the Kurdish part, of course, of Iraq, but who brings it to Israel? Through Turkey. And here money talks. So Israel has to, and don't forget the future gas, which we have all kinds of plans about Turkey as a potential buyer because it's close and prices and so forth. So Israel tries to understand the map, which changes almost every day, but to stay intact as much as possible in order not to be sucked into this mayhem which is in Syria.
Mr. Oren?
When you talk with Israeli officers who take part in the coordination effort with the Russians, they would tell you that the Russians are very strict. They keep to their playbook. There is almost no small talk. They do not deviate from the instructions that they get from Moscow. And the Israelis in these talks make clear that they have no ambitions other than to protect Israel and to protect the forces which are trying to enforce Israel's red lines regarding the transfer of weapons to Hezbollah and the like. Now, Israel, the Israeli Defense Forces, are very adaptive. Once they saw that there is a problem with Russian flights over Syria, they lessened the use of air power and moved much more heavily to the use of ground rockets. If they want to hit a pinpoint target and they are afraid that their fighter planes will be at least illuminated by Russian radar, fine, they fire from Israeli territory.
Well, we're drawing to an end of this program, and I'd like to give each and every one of you a closing sentence. Professor Hanin?
A couple of weeks ago, I spoke to a person who is pretty close to the process of making military political decisions there in Moscow. So he asked me a question, okay, why Israel is so against over the Russian presence on the border between Israel, Jordania, and Syria. What changed actually? We gave you a guarantee that nothing would happen, since Israel is not interfering. So what changed now from the Israeli point of view? From the Israeli point of view, the thing that has changed is that actually Russia is going to take much more active part in Syrian issues. And we would like to believe that there is no reconsiderations of previous agreements.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Kedar?
Well, when I look at the Syrian arena, I think that the country which will have the biggest influence on the future of Syria, and of course the relations with Israel, is not Russia, not America, not Turkey, it is Iran. Iran actually, with the forces which it has already on the ground, definitely establishes its hegemony over Syria, and I think it will be for many years from now.
Mr. Oren, one word?
Putin and perhaps Assad will outlive Trump and perhaps Netanyahu in power.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Professor Hanin, Mr. Oren, and Dr. Kedar for coming here, and I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time. TV7 Israel's mission is to give you, our viewers, truthful information, which in effect will give you a chance to really understand what is happening in Israel and its region. If you're blessed by our programs and believe our mission to be important, we urge you to support us and become a voice for Israel. You can support us by going to our website at tv7israelnews.com. This program was made possible through your donations.